Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending from where you are joining. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you today to this online briefing. My name is Renata Dalaqua, and I work at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, where I lead the Gender and Disarmament Program. Today, we are having this regional briefing on the topic of armed conflict and sexual violence, trends, analysis, and ideas for action. The focus of this meeting today is to have a conversation with Asia Pacific states. So we are very excited to have this opportunity. We see colleagues joining from different parts of the region, and we are also very pleased to be joined by Mr. Kaushal Kishor, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative of Nepal to the UN in New York. Today's event is an opportunity for UNIDIR to share research findings and receive comments and feedbacks on the linkages between increased militarization, the proliferation of weapons, and sexual and gender-based violence. This is an activity of the Gender and Disarmament Program in collaboration with our colleagues from a different project at UNIDIR, the project on managing exits from armed conflict, which is in short called MEAC. So today you will hear from some colleagues that work at UNIDIR that will present their research. First, it will be my colleague Hana Salama. Hana will provide us with an overview of the linkages between weapons and conflict-related sexual violence. And her presentation will be followed by a presentation from Anamika Madhuraj, who is an associate researcher coordinator with the MEAC project at UNIDIR. And she will share insights from empirical research carried out with people affected by armed conflict and sexual violence in various contexts. These presentations will be followed by a Q&A, where we would like to hear from the audience regarding ideas for dialogue, research, and action. So we encourage you to participate during the Q&A so we can have an interactive meeting. After the Q&A, we'll have the pleasure to hear from Mr. Ray, Deputy Permanent Representative of Nepal to the UN in New York, who will deliver concluding remarks. We are extremely honored by his participation. Before I hand over to the presenters, I'd like to note that today's event is being recorded and will be uploaded to UNIDIR's YouTube channel. We will write to each of you later with the link, so you can also share and disseminate this among your networks. Now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Hana Salama for her presentation.
Thank you, Renata. And I'd like to personally thank everybody for taking the time out of their day to be with us here today. As mentioned, I'll be presenting UNIDIR's research on the linkages between the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and conflict-related sexual violence. But before we start, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the Gender and Disarmament Program here at UNIDIR. So at the program, our core business is analyzing the gendered impacts of armed violence and examining how gender norms shape the role of weapons in society. We do this by carrying out research on the gendered impacts of different types of weapons, dialogue and capacity building activities, which contribute to gender equality and improving women's participation in all areas of international security. We think that by translating gender awareness into policy action, we can help ensure that arms control and disarmament processes deliver for everyone. I wanted also to let you know that this work wouldn't be possible without our generous donors, who are Canada, Germany, Ireland, Malta, and Norway. So on to the presentation. Can you see the slides?
Not really, Hana. Maybe I should try sharing from my side.
Yeah, because I can't see them.
If I can, why can I see? Okay.
I can see the slides now. Can you also see? Okay.
I'm trying to make it.
Yeah, we can see. It's fine.
Okay, perfect. Let me just start. As you all know, conflict-related sexual violence is a complex phenomenon, and it has multiple overlapping causes, including gender inequality, and which is an enabling factor rooted in the conflict itself. One of these factors, these conflict-related factors, includes the proliferation of weapons, which is fueling systematic and widespread conflict-related sexual violence. And this is specifically small arms and light weapons. And the reason why I mention small arms and light weapons is because they are the weapon of choice by armed groups which are involved in civil war or internal armed conflict, as they are relatively cheap, portable, easy to traffic and conceal. And this fact has been recognized for several years now by the UN Secretary General and many states who recognize that increased militarization and the proliferation of small arms and light weapons is a factor that is fueling conflict-related sexual violence. However, beyond this kind of recognition, little has been done to address weapons proliferation as part of efforts to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. So in our research, we tried to address this gap, first by exploring the linkages between small arms and light weapons and conflict-related sexual violence, and second, by identifying entry points where arms control and disarmament treaties, instruments, tools, and measures can be leveraged in the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. So first, I'd like to share with you the methodology of the report. This report, which was published in 2023, was based on a review of publicly available incident data on CRSV collected by hospitals, humanitarian agencies, the UN, civil society, and others. It was also informed by a number of key informant interviews, specifically with prevention practitioners, such as UN Women Protection Advisors in several UN peace operations, caseworkers in humanitarian agency, as well as arms control and disarmament experts. We also did an extensive review of the UN frameworks and policy guidance on preventing and responding to CRSV, and we conducted one in-person focused group discussion in Khartoum, Sudan in January 2023. And this brought together national authorities, survivor organizations, UN and international organizations, all who are working on conflict-related sexual violence. So what were the findings of our report? The report found that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in conflict can be linked to sexual violence in two ways. First, directly, as weapons and ammunition are used by perpetrators to commit rape, threaten, or coerce individuals into acts of sexual violence against their will, as well as injure and kill survivors and victims of sexual violence. Second, there are indirect links, as weapon proliferations contribute to fueling armed conflicts, which in turn propagate the conditions that lead to CRSV and other types of gender-based violence. So first, on the direct links, we found that in general, there is very limited data on weapons and conflict-related sexual violence. Most of the data just referred to armed actors as the perpetrators, but they don't mention the specific type of arms. However, data from Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, and the Panzi Hospital, which is a hospital specialized in the care of survivors of CRSV in the DRC, indicated that in the conflict-affected areas of the DRC, between 40 and 60% of CRSV involved a weapon. When we spoke to these hospitals, they indeed mentioned the fact that small arms and light weapons play a role, but they their data collection still didn't capture the type of weapons precisely. So we looked at another data set from a civil society organization called Insecurity Insight, and this was the only one that identified firearms as specifically as part of CRSV incidents. And so, according to Insecurity Insight, in 2022, 70 to 90% of CRSV incidents that they recorded in 6 countries involved a firearm. And you can see the 6 countries on the slides, but they are the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Sudan, Sudan, and Ukraine. And UNIDIR is currently reviewing this data and updating it, and hopefully that will be shared in a new report. Then, when we looked at, on the other side, the indirect links, we saw that there were studies from South Sudan and DR Congo that, for example, have shown that the same conditions that lead to increased conflict violence, for example, increased militarization and the proliferation of small arms, also led to an increase in intimate partner violence. Another example is Ukraine. So not only has the UN documented many cases of conflict-related sexual violence that were facilitated by weapons, but local CSO have also documented a 400% increase in calls to the police about domestic violence and intimate partner violence in January 2023 compared to the same time period in the previous years. In addition to the direct and the indirect links, which I just mentioned, our interviews with practitioners in the field also revealed additional links where much more research is needed to unpack them. So just to give you a couple of examples of those links, and I'm sure they're familiar to you, but the links between criminal groups and armed groups in the trafficking of women and girls for the purpose of sexual exploitation in conflict often take advantage of conflict and the breakdown in borders, not only to traffic women, but also arms for financial gain. We also had some anecdotal evidence that in cross-border trafficking of weapons by criminal armed groups, they may be using sexual violence as a way of coercing women into trafficking roles. And indeed, when speaking to practitioners and experts from the DRC, we found that there was a high correlation between the mining, sexual violence in the mining areas which are controlled by these armed groups and who traffic illicit minerals to purchase weapons to sustain their fighting or the conflict. So here, as I said, these are some of the additional links we found that would need more research to sort of unpack these links with CRSV and weapons. Now, next slide, please. Based on these linkages, we proposed a arms control and disarmament toolbox for preventing CRSV. And this toolbox includes multiple treaties, instruments, and measures which address the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. So at the multilateral level, this includes the Arms Trade Treaty, the UN Programme of Action, and the Firearms Protocol, which address both the legal and policy framework for small arms control, and this, we found, can support the long-term prevention. It also includes measures and tools, what we call arms control tools, that can be relevant for different phases of a conflict and can limit access to weapons of perpetrators of CRSV, and therefore it can contribute to a more short-term operational prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. So just to give you an example, the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty, might be one of the most important treaties for the prevention of CRSV. First, because it's legally binding, and it also explicitly prohibits parties of the treaty to export arms in country where there is widespread IHL violations or human rights abuses under Article 6. And, a legal opinion published by the RCRC acknowledged that CRSV is, of course, included as a serious violation of IHL. But in addition, it also specifically requires states to conduct risk assessments on the possibilities that weapons can be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of GBV under Article 7.4. So in this case, we can say that CRSV is covered by 2 articles for the Arms Trade Treaty, and it's really relevant for supporting the prevention of both GBV and conflict-related sexual violence. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the toolbox also includes measures that can be relevant during different phases of a conflict that can limit the access of weapons to perpetrators of CRSV and contributing to short-term prevention. So these measures include disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, known as DDR, civilian disarmament programs, weapons and ammunition management, community violence reduction, and security sector reform, which can be leveraged at different points of the conflict. So if we move on to the next slide, the next one, please, you will see a lovely depiction of our toolbox. And here you can see that in the pre-conflict phase, we can integrate weapons-related indicators into CRSV early warning, which could already support the prevention of CRSV. And this is something that many practitioners that we interviewed had agreed, is that they see the proliferation of weapons as a problem, but they don't have specific knowledge about it. And so they would appreciate indicators related to militarization and weapons, which may help them assess the risk of CRSV in the early stages of the conflict. Sorry. And during the conflict, different tools can be leveraged. For example, arms embargoes or sanctions that can be leveraged to limit access to weapons and limit the flow of weapons into the country. And in the transitional phase, weapon and ammunition management, which can strengthen physical security and stockpile management of weapons and ammunition to effectively minimize the risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition that, again, can facilitate sexual and gender-based violence, as well as mentioned before, DDR and SSR, which in some cases already address the risk of conflict-related sexual violence, but it can go further in terms of the disarmament component of DDR by enhancing women's participation in disarmament campaigns, reviewing existing regulations, for example, on who can be given a weapon and whether members of the security forces can take their service weapons home. So UNIDIR is also conducting new research on how UN peace operations can apply some of the tools in this toolbox to effectively prevent both CRSV and SGBV. And our research will be looking at more in detail on the short-term operational measures, including arms embargoes, community violence reduction, and DDR and weapons and ammunition management. So still more to come from UNIDIR on this topic. Right now, I'd like to conclude and offer a few recommendations that can be useful in multilateral discussions around conflict-related sexual violence. I think that this report proposed a number of recommendations which can facilitate the integration of gender-responsive arms control into these efforts. So the first is really raising awareness about this topic and increasing the understanding of the linkages between the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and CRSV through supporting more research, as mentioned before, but also data collection at the national level in individual conflicts and looking at strengthening disaggregated data by weapon type. Bringing attention to these linkages in discussions around small arms control, so in forums such as the Arms Trade Treaty, Conference of State Parties, or the UN POA biennial meeting of states, but also vice versa. So we're seeing a lot more integration of arms control and disarmament measures into discussions and prevention efforts on conflict-related sexual violence. So, for example, the UN Prevention Framework on conflict-related sexual violence does include arms control and disarmament as an important long-term measure for prevention. And finally, we think that it's really important to include survivors and survivor associations in decision-making around arms control and disarmament at all levels. So this is going back to the idea I shared in terms of disarmament campaigns, but also, during multilateral meetings to ensure that they are represented and that their concerns and perspectives are shared. And just to offer a concluding thought, I think that there is a lot of progress in this area. And as I mentioned, some of these measures, such as DDR and SSR, are already in place and already taking place, but perhaps need to be implemented in a gender-responsive way. This is important because considering CRSV risks and gender perspectives can contribute to changing gender norms and attitudes by promoting women's participation in decision-making about security issues, including arms control and disarmament, which traditionally has been a male-dominated field. Thereby, it can address both the short-term and long-term more structural causes, such as gender inequality of CRSV. So that is it from me. I look forward to hearing from you, your feedback on this research, and also any questions at the end of my colleague's presentation. And I would like to pass it to Anamika, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Hana. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for making time for this briefing. If I can have the slides back up, Benedict. Okay, thanks, Benedict. So as mentioned, I'll be sharing findings from UNIDIR's Managing Exits from Armed Conflict Project, or MEAC for short, based on our recent research in the Lake Chad Basin, as well as Colombia. And as you can tell from the slide, this is our logo of logos here of our donors and partners. And we are really an all-of-UN effort that tries to better understand how and why people exit armed groups and what it means for them to fully and sustainably return to civilian life. Next slide, please. So I will begin with our findings from the Lake Chad Basin, where we looked at the experiences of women and girls associated with Boko Haram in the region. Next slide, please. So in the Lake Chad Basin, MEAC has been collecting data since 2020. We've conducted 19 surveys so far, interviewing women, men, girls, and boys as young as 12. And alongside surveys, we do qualitative research to explore topics that are less suited to structured questionnaires. And the findings that I'll be presenting today are based on interviews and focus groups held between February and October 2024 in Cameroon, Chad, and Nigeria. So 3 different contexts with former associates of Boko Haram as well as community members. Next slide, please. Our first key finding relates to forced marriage. We found that Boko Haram factions have systematically engaged in sexual and gender-based violence, with forced marriage being extremely widespread. Girls, widows, and even married women were not spared. In Nigeria, 59% of women and girls in our sample reported being married while with the group, and many actually more than once. So they've had to remarry after the death or capture of their husbands, which means in practice multiple forced marriages. Second, most of these women and girls remain married to their so-called Boko Haram husbands even after exits. And this has been over 80% in Nigeria. So legal avenues for divorce are unfortunately extremely rare. And if you couple that with factors like economic dependence and the fear of losing their children if they do separate from their husbands, it makes separation extremely challenging and impossible for many of these women and girls. And this really begs the question as to what reintegration can really look like if you're still married to someone from an armed group. Our third finding is that some reintegration efforts actually unintentionally reinforce harm. So in Nigeria, women and girls who exited alone were often held in transit centers until their Boko Haram husbands, often the men that they were forced to marry, also exited from the group. And they were then reunited by authorities with no clear indication of consent. In some cases, assistance in transit centers were also often channeled through men. This meant that unmarried or widowed women had to rely on male intermediaries, and some of them actually withheld a portion of that aid as their payment for being the intermediary. Our fourth finding is that many women and girls self-reintegrate, returning to crisis-affected communities with very little or absolutely no formal support. So even those who surrender formally are often deprioritized because they're not seen as a security threat. And as a result, assistance remains really geared towards men, despite many women caring for multiple children and facing extreme and severe livelihood insecurity. Next slide, please. In terms of recommendations, we need to stop viewing women and girls exiting armed groups solely as victims, wives, or daughters. Many played diverse roles, fighting or providing logistical support in sustaining armed groups, and yet DDR responses continue to overlook them. And to change this, we need to meaningfully include women and girls in DDR design through advisory mechanisms and sustained support for grassroots women's organizations. And the second thing is that their socioeconomic independence must be prioritized. So reintegration often takes place in climate-affected, crisis-prone areas where women face the greatest constraints. So support could potentially look like access to land and credit, climate-smart livelihoods, and financial and literacy training to build long-term reliance. Next slide, please. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, next I will very quickly go through our findings from Colombia, specifically looking at our findings from working with the NASA indigenous community in North Kafka, and looking at how sexual violence intersects with conflict dynamics. So this particular research draws on interviews and focus groups conducted in July 2024 with community actors who actually have direct visibility on sexual violence and recruitment in that particular community. So specifically, we interviewed the NASA Indigenous Guard, which is a community protection force, as well as leaders from ASEAN's Women's Department, which is part of a local indigenous governance body in the region. Next slide, please. Our findings, well, our first finding is that some survivors of sexual violence are actually joining armed groups in search of justice. This is because the mechanisms available in their communities, so in this particular context, the indigenous justice system often fail to deliver accountability. So survivors often face disbelief from their community. They're re-victimized when they mention their experience, and there's very little or absolutely no penalties for perpetrators, leaving them without adequate support, redress, or protection. Second, these dynamics obviously occur in a broader context of unequal gender norms and roles, and these norms continue to shape how violence is responded to and really contribute a culture of impunity. Third, community perceptions are deeply divided. So men in particular actually tend to externalize the problem, attributing sexual violence to armed groups rather than acknowledge its presence within the community and the role of local men in contributing towards it. And this denial, of course, undermines efforts to confront the issue and reinforces harmful gender stereotypes. Finally, while most survivors are women and girls, we also heard accounts of boys and men experiencing sexual violence, though these cases remain even less recognized and even less supported. Next slide, please. Our recommendations target both institutions and communities. So for authorities, we recommend strengthening policy and guidance to improve how sexual violence cases are reported, tracked, and resolved. Confidential data gathering is a must, and that could help assess justice outcomes and guide improvements. Institutions also need clearer roles and regular training, especially when it comes to male survivors, to reduce stigma and improve case handling. At the community level, we call on members to report cases, provide support, and create safe spaces. And this includes denouncing machismo, easier said than done, and strengthening family support and participating in efforts to challenge harmful norms and prevent violence. Next slide, please. Lastly, the findings from both the Lake Chad Basin and Colombia that I discussed today are linked to these reports on the slide, which you're welcome to access using the QR codes in display. Thank you so much, and back to you, Renata.
Thank you very much, Hana and Anamika, for providing this overview of different research projects. You know, these research projects, they were produced kind of in parallel, so it's not kind of a very intentional thread going through it, but it just highlights how gender-based violence is an international security problem, and how it is a part of a continuum of violence against women and girls that exists in society before, during, and persists after conflict. What Hana showed us today is that even though it seems like a very common sense thing to associate weapons with conflict-related sexual violence, we are still at early stages in terms of getting a systematic analysis of the data. And until we don't have a specific, like a very solid overview of the linkages between weapons and conflict-related sexual violence, it's a bit more difficult to convince the arms control and disarmament community that this is an issue, you know, that should be of their concern. For sure, data is not the solution to everything. You also need, you know, political commitment and resources to tackle the problem. But data is usually, you know, a first step in understanding the problem and mobilizing support for action. So this is what I think, you know, Hana's presentation showed, is what whenever we have the data, the correlation is very high between weapons and conflict-related sexual violence. Anamika presented something that it's a bit broader than conflict-related sexual violence, because, you know, it's gender-based violence as an umbrella term that includes violence such as forced marriage. But also you can think, you know, forced pregnancy, sexual exploitation, enforced prostitution, sexual slavery, and femicides. These are all acts, encompassed by the terminology of gender-based violence. And the cases that Anamika brought to us today, they are based on empirical data with people exiting conflict in two different settings, one in South America, in Colombia, the other one in Africa, in Lake Chad Basin. And I know today, we are meeting here with colleagues from the Asia Pacific region, so we didn't have specific data from that region, but now we have, 15 minutes for discussion, open discussion, and we would like to hear from the audience. How do the findings of these reports that were presented today, how do they apply to regional realities? Do you have information, data, insights, analysis to share from your region on this? Do you have best practices regarding data collection, but also regarding programs that aim to support survivors or to contribute to prevention of gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence? Because we are a research institute, we are always interested, new areas for research. If you have ideas of where we should be looking at to improve our knowledge between increased militarization, proliferation of weapons, and sexual and gender-based violence. We are also very interested in supporting survivors, in supporting people exiting armed groups. If you have also, experiences related to DDR to share with us, this is also very relevant to our ongoing work. These questions, they are presented here in this slide. We'll keep them up. But as you can see, we are interested in best practices, ideas for research, and then for people working at national policy or international policy, how can we better address the linkages between international security and these sort of issues that are sometimes considered to be, public health or social affairs, or even, quote unquote, domestic issues as intimate partner violence. What can we do to break the silos between what is considered to be, issues related to women's safety and issues related to international security? If you would like to participate by asking a question, you can write in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I will give you the floor, and you can put your question and direct it to Anamika, to Hana, or to or to all of us, so we can think together about these issues. I'm sure, Hana also has a follow-up project that she's working on this topic, focused on UN peace operations, how UN peace operations can enhance their role in this area. I see we have someone, Charvi Dugal, who would like to make a comment. Would you like to take the floor?
Hello, I'm so sorry. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Charvi Dukkal, and I was working as a legal fellow with the United Nations Department of Peace Operation. So I was working with UNESCO and UN peacekeepers. And plus, I was also helping out the Department of Women, wherein we did deal with the conflict-related sexual violence issues in the DRC. So since you've asked for one research area, and you've presented this whole wonderful presentation, just by the way, I think one of the strategies which wasn't mentioned, although transitional justice as a whole was mentioned. But one of the strategies which my department specifically follows is also that we have kind of like a truth commission, but not really a truth commission, wherein all the women who have faced sexual violence can speak out their issues behind the doors, not in the open court. And we kind of have established our mandate for a hybrid court, wherein judges from both international arena as well as the local come together to resolve an issue regarding this. Although this is not foolproof, but it's kind of working out. So maybe this can be further researched. It's not really a fully functional court, and it's also not a truth commission, but something new which has been followed. So it's like still in process to explore whether this is working out or not. So
thank you very much for sharing this practice, Charvi. I think, I mean, we hadn't discussed this before, so that's certainly something, you know, that we'll look into it. And I know that truth commissions and this kind of things are very common in transitional justice approaches. So I think there is a lot of synergy with people exiting, like when a society or a community is exiting conflict. And it's something that could certainly be associated with CRSV, at least, you know, some sort of accountability framework. And if it's not, you know, as you said, a completely formal legal system, it can serve the purpose, I suppose, of bringing some closure as well. So I think that's a super interesting approach. And I'll give the floor to my colleagues to also react on this. But I will also read a few comments we had in the chat, and then I'll pass it to Hana and Anamika so they can reflect both on the practice shared by Charvi and also the comments from the chat. We have a comment about non-state actors accessing weapons, and I think that is a problem that, you know, the arms control and disarmament community has tried to work to prevent it from happening. So yes, illegal transfers, illicit transfers of weapons to conflict areas where non-state actors access these weapons. And this was the comment from our colleague Emma Chandra Basapa in the chat. And then we also have a comment from Eli Kiyotomaki from Ayansa. About research, not on weapons, but ammunition, and how, you know, we can do research connecting ammunition to the issue of CRSV and SGBV, noting that there is a new framework, the global framework on ammunition that has been adopted by states recently. So that also provides an opportunity for renewed interest in preventing the illicit transfers of weapons and ammunition on this issue as well. And then we have a third comment on the chat about research and study of weapons that go missing. So these are very interesting comments. I would now give the floor Hana and then Anamika to react and comment on this too.
Thank you, Renata, and thank you, Charvi, Eli, and our colleague Himachandra for your your comments and your questions, all very interesting, all that would take a lot of time to properly unpack and discuss. I really want to thank you, Charvi, for bringing attention to the hybrid and mobile cohorts that were first piloted in MONUSCO for CRSV. I think what I read from the reports, it's been a very successful practice that is also being replicated in other UN peace operations. I think it would be really interesting to have a follow-up conversation, as well as how do these truth commissions feature weapons, or the knowledge that these victims have of weapons. It would be really interesting to hear if they themselves, the survivors, talk about the armed perpetrator and the weapon and how it was used, and the traumatic experience. Yeah, we can explore more avenues for collaboration. I think that this kind of thing would give us more data and evidence about how weapons are used in these incidents, and we know that they are. So it would be interesting, and I'm all for sort of hybrid and what do we say, like transitional justice mechanisms. And I recently heard about a great program giving sort of rapid compensation to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, and in the absence of formal legal processes, being able to give them some resources where they can restart their life and go into some sort of social economic activity, which I think is a great idea. On the question from Himachandra on weapons and ammunition management, is what we call it here at UNIDIR. And yes, UNIDIR has conducted lots of assessments in some of these conflict contexts that were mentioned, which assess how well countries can manage their weapons and ammunition, and what are the risks for diversion and leakages. And our team here at the Conventional Arms Program conducts these assessments with the view of giving recommendations to national authorities about how they can improve this. Obviously, in the context of the DRC, for example, or Nigeria, these are huge borders and very porous, not only because of lack of resources, but also the cultural connections and community connections across borders, which tend to facilitate some of the illicit activity. I believe that there's been many organizations who have conducted research specifically on weapons that go missing from peace operations or from different national authorities. And so I can refer you to some of the specific publication by other organizations who tend to do more case studies or look more at the national context. And then, Ellie, I think it's a great suggestion in terms of ammunition diversion and risks of human rights abuse and risk of SGBV in particular. That's definitely something that's been on my mind and the mind of many, actually. I think there's a few challenges, again, related to data, like how can we know that this ammunition that was used in an incident of sexual violence is diverted? A lot of tracing efforts need to be conducted. So if you have any ideas of how we can proceed with this kind of research, I would be happy to speak to you also in a follow-up conversation. Thanks. Over to you, Anamika.
Thanks, Hana. I think you well answered questions from both Hemachandra and Ellie. So maybe I'll quickly go back to what you mentioned, Charvi. Thank you for that example that you raised. I think what you described resonates quite well with our findings in Colombia, where we worked with the NASA indigenous community. And, I just want to mention that our approach was highly participatory. So we involved local leaders from the indigenous justice system in every stage, from research design, to co-developing recommendations. But as you mentioned, we also saw some of those limits of that system in handling sexual violence, especially when it comes to confidentiality, survivor safety, and impunity. So your mention of hybrid models that combines international and local mechanisms, I think that's a very relevant one for us, especially that idea of offering closed-door testimony. And I think, it overall speaks to the need for justice systems that are both context sensitive, but as well as survivor centered. And I think this is a space where maybe more comparative research and documentation could really help us move the needle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anamika and Hana. And thank you to all the colleagues that intervened and posed questions in the chat. It's been really nice to hear your thoughts and learn of future avenues that we at UNIDIR can pursue. Now I would like to move to the final part of our meeting. We are having closing remarks by Mr. Kaushal Kishor Ray, who is joining us from New York. Mr. Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Renata. Good morning, colleagues. I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much. Indeed, it has been very interesting event. Distinguished speakers, participants. This is Kaushal Kishor Rai, Deputy Permanent Representative of Nepal to the UN New York. I would like to express my sincere thanks to colleagues from UNIDIR for inviting me to speak in the regional briefing on armed conflict and conflict-related sexual violence, on trends, analysis, and ideas for action for the Asia-Pacific states. I also extend my sincere appreciation to the speakers for the insightful remarks, highlighting the issues around armed conflict and CRSV. I wish to deeply appreciate Ms. Hana Salama for her wonderful research and report on addressing weapons in CRSV, arms control, and disarmament toolbox. The research will definitely contribute to enrich the understanding of the issue and help address the CRSV. We have already heard directly from Ms. Hana about her research. I wish to emphasize that it indeed explores the links between the proliferation of weapons, particularly small arms and light weapons, and CRSV. It also offers an overview of how different arms control and disarmament treaties, tools, instruments, and measures can be leveraged throughout the conflict cycle to strengthen prevention of this form of violence. In the same way, we also heard from Anamika about the research and the two case studies. I'm confident that the gender-responsive arms control and disarmament policies, as suggested by the report, will be very helpful in addressing and preventing CRSV. Distinguished participants, dear friends, Nepal attaches high importance to preventing, combating, and eradicating the illicit trade and proliferation of small arms and light weapons. We believe that an integrated approach to silencing the barrel should accommodate addressing the root causes of conflict and violence. The dynamics of armed conflict, organized crime, and violence are heavily influenced by the extent and intensity of illicit distribution and misuse of small arms and light weapons. These weapons remain key enablers of conflict and violence. They may be smaller in size, but they have severe impact, including exacerbating conflict-related sexual violence. CRSV in Asia and the Pacific remains a critical issue as well, driven by the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and their illicit trade. On the one hand, the widespread availability of these weapons perpetuates cycles of violence, displaces populations, and weakens governance, making it difficult to establish effective institutions and uphold the rule of law. On the other hand, armed conflict and violence disrupt economic activities, deter investment, and divert resources away from development. We urge that technological advancement should be utilized to prevent the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and their illicit trade, not to help them thrive. We are fully convinced that addressing the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and their illicit trade requires strong global cooperation. However, we are falling short of it. In this vein, We emphasize the importance of the full and effective implementation of the Program of Action and the International Tracing Instrument for attaining Goal 16 and Target 16.4 of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Nepal reaffirms the crucial role of governments in implementing the robust national legislation, enhance law enforcement capacities, and ensure strict control over small arms throughout their cycle. That's why LDCs like Nepal should be provided with enhanced and sustained financial, technical, and technological support. We call for diverting resources to address the root causes of poverty and inequality from production, proliferation, and the illicit trade of small arms and light weapons. To conclude, I wish to emphasize that arms control and disarmament toolbox must be gender sensitive, legally binding, and strongly enforced to effectively prevent and address CRSV. Stronger international cooperation, strict regulations on small arms light weapons proliferation, and accountability mechanisms can help break the link between armed conflict and sexual violence. With this, I would like to conclude my remarks. Thank you very much, Renata, once again for inviting me. And it is a very lovely to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rai, for your participation and for Nepal overall, partnership with UNIDIR and collaboration on several initiatives addressing gender, arms control, and disarmament. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with your delegation. I think, it's time for us to wrap up. I would like to thank you, everyone who joined. It's been really nice having this exchange with you, and we look forward to staying in touch. So please feel free to reach out, and I'm sure we can continue the conversation bilaterally and continue to explore opportunities for collaboration and for this integrated approach to arms control and disarmament that addresses gender inequalities and makes a positive contribution in the world. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a very fruitful day or evening, depending where you're joining from, and let's stay in touch. Thank you. Goodbye.